NATO allies are set to meet this week, likely against the backdrop of a protracted war in Ukraine that will put considerably more Ukrainian civilian lives at risk. And it's a war that the Ukrainian President Zelensky is arguing could have been avoided altogether, saying this weekend that, quote, if we were a NATO member, a war wouldn't have started. And further calling on NATO to give Ukraine some sort of clarity as to whether or not they will ever be able to join the alliance. Joining us now is Heather Conley, president of the German Marshall Fund. She's also a former deputy assistant secretary of state for Europe and Eurasian affairs, where she co-led the U.S. interagency effort to enlarge NATO. Heather, good to see you. Thank you for joining us again. Certainly the growth of NATO in the beginning and then subsequent to the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the fall of the Berlin Wall, it's not clear, I think, to most of our viewers how these former Warsaw Pact countries came to be NATO countries and why some of them didn't. But what's the Cliff's Notes version of that and what Zelensky is asking for? Let us in now.
Well, the Cliff Notes is the Washington Treaty, which established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949. There's an article, Article 10, that says a membership is available and open to those European countries that can assume the responsibilities of becoming a NATO member. So this is why NATO enlargement has proceeded since 1949 up to now 30 members of NATO. Obviously, as NATO expanded, it becomes more challenging to make decisions at 30, but it is a strong and vibrant alliance. Now, the members that want to join NATO, yes, NATO members have to accept them, and we closely scrutinize every aspirant country's application. They have to have a strong defense. They have to have, strong democracies and being able to accept the responsibility. So it's not just a let us in, it is a process, but it is open to all European countries that can accept those responsibilities. So the thing is, it's very difficult to bring in a member when you have such a dramatic situation at hand. But I will tell you what Vladimir Putin is doing is making more countries want to join NATO, neutral countries like Sweden, like Finland, because the Russians are really threatening their freedom of choice to join alliances. So the more threatening Vladimir Putin becomes, the more countries that want to seek the security umbrella of NATO. So he's creating these conditions. In 2014, the Ukrainian constitution ensured that Ukraine was a neutral country by annexing Crimea and invading Donbass in 2014. It was Vladimir Putin who forced the Ukrainian government to change its constitution to want to be more closely aligned with NATO. So again, Moscow has to accept its strategic failures. The more it takes these actions, the more countries want to join NATO.
That was such a great crystal clear explanation about why countries join, how they join. So thank you for that. But now I want to get your reaction to the other thing that President Zelensky said over the weekend, arguing that, quote, if we were a NATO member, this war would not have started. Those were his words. Is he right? Would this war never have taken place? Would Russia have just not done it, not gone across the border if Ukraine were a NATO member? Because really the second part of my question is that countries like I'm in, Poland, really do fear Russian expansionism, and they feel that if they get away with Ukraine, the Russians could just continue to move further west or northwest and take other countries. Is that possible?
Well, I think there is some truth to what President Zelensky said, because you look at the three Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Poland is another example. When these countries joined NATO, they did have a strong sense of defense, of deterrence, of reassurance that should Russia become the Russia that it is today, an aggressor state, a revisionist state, they would be protected. This is what President Zelensky is asking for Ukraine right now. The challenge is, Ali, it's the geopolitical conditions that allow this membership to proceed. So we had two geostrategic openings, particularly in 1999, that brought in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. In 2002, the NATO enlargement round that I was involved in, it brought in the 3 Baltic states, as well as Slovenia, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. NATO has continued to enlarge even past that point, but it was that we had that opportunity to do it. But now we have a very different Russia. And so we have to bring that into consideration. But look, NATO enlargement is not done. That geopolitical window will open. And this is where we have to have the closest possible relationship between NATO and Ukraine, between NATO and other former Soviet states like the Republic of Georgia, because when that geopolitical window opens, we want their candidacy to be strong, them to be in the best position for NATO and the European Union, if that's possible, to continue to expand eastward. That's what Mr. Putin fears. This is really not, though, Ali, let me be very clear. It's not about membership in NATO. It's not membership in the European Union. What Vladimir Putin fears is the freedom of choice and the dignity of the individual. He cannot allow that in Russia and retain his power. If Ukraine becomes a thriving, prosperous, and secure democracy, that is his greatest threat. And membership in NATO or membership in the European Union just represents that freedom of choice and that dignity. And that is what Mr. Putin will not allow to stand in Ukraine. And he's trying to destroy Ukraine before he allows them to join that family of democracies.